The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado, California. Among the 520 elite Navy SEALs gathered for the annual combat demonstration, Sarah Mitchell stood quietly near the back of the crowd. At 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she didn't look like someone who belonged among the most elite warriors in the world. Her plain civilian clothes and calm demeanor made her nearly invisible among the sea of uniformed soldiers. Sarah had arrived at the base that morning as part of a special Pentagon initiative to evaluate new combat training methods. As a former Marine Corps martial arts instructor and current Department of Defense consultant, she possessed credentials that few people knew about. Her background remained classified, known only to a select few high-ranking officials who had personally witnessed her exceptional abilities during her 8 years of active military service. The demonstration was being conducted in the main training arena, a massive facility designed to showcase the most advanced combat techniques used by America's Special Forces. Rows of bleachers surrounded a central mat area where various training scenarios would be displayed throughout the day. The air buzzed with excitement and testosterone as hundreds of the nation's most elite warriors prepared to show off their skills. Among the crowd, Staff Sergeant Marcus Reynolds commanded attention wherever he went. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with broad shoulders and arms like tree trunks, Marcus had earned his reputation through 12 years of distinguished service as a Navy SEAL. His chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals, including 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star earned during multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. His square jaw and piercing blue eyes gave him the appearance of someone carved from granite. Marcus had spent the morning bragging to anyone who would listen about his latest accomplishments. He had recently returned from a classified mission in Syria where his team had successfully extracted high-value targets under intense enemy fire. The mission had been featured in several military publications, though most details remained secret. His confidence bordered on arrogance as he recounted stories of hand-to-hand combat victories and his undefeated record in the base's weekly sparring competitions. "I've been fighting since I could walk," Marcus told a group of younger SEALs who hung on his every word. "Grew up in Detroit, learned to use my fists before I learned to read. Been in more fights than most people have had hot meals. Never met anyone who could take me down, and I never will." The crowd around Marcus laughed and nodded approvingly. His reputation for toughness was well established throughout the SEAL community. He had earned the nickname, the Hammer, for his devastating striking ability and had never lost a sanctioned fight during his military career. Stories of his prowess had spread throughout multiple military bases, creating an almost mythical status around his fighting abilities. Sarah observed the gathering from her position near the equipment storage area. She had been taking notes on training methodologies and equipment effectiveness when she noticed the commotion around Marcus. His loud voice carried clearly across the arena as he continued his boastful commentary about various combat techniques and his superiority over other fighters he had encountered. "The problem with most people," Marcus announced to his growing audience, "is they don't understand what real fighting looks like. All this fancy martial arts stuff you see in movies is just dancing. When bullets are flying and lives are on the line, you need someone who can break bones and fights fast. That's what separates real warriors from weekend warriors." Several of the SEALs around him nodded in agreement. Marcus had a way of making his experiences sound more dramatic and heroic than anyone else's. His stories often featured him as the central figure who saved the day through superior fighting skills and tactical thinking. While some of his claims were exaggerated, his core abilities were genuine enough to maintain his reputation among his peers. The formal demonstration began with various teams showing advanced weapons handling and tactical maneuvers. Sarah watched with professional interest, occasionally making notes about techniques that might be useful for training programs she was developing. Her expertise in combat systems allowed her to evaluate the effectiveness of different approaches with a critical eye that most observers lacked. During a break between demonstrations, Marcus spotted Sarah standing alone near the edge of the arena. Something about her presence irritated him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, or the fact that she seemed unimpressed by the impressive displays of military prowess happening around her. "Hey, lady," Marcus called out loud enough for others to hear. This is a restricted area. Are you sure you're supposed to be here? Sarah looked up from her notepad and met his gaze calmly. I have proper authorization, she replied simply, returning to her notes without elaborating further. Marcus felt a flash of annoyance at her dismissive response. He was accustomed to respect and deference from civilians, especially women who visited military facilities. Sarah's calm indifference to his presence struck him as disrespectful. Several other SEALs had noticed the exchange and were watching to see how it would develop. Authorization for what exactly? Marcus pressed, taking several steps closer to Sarah. Because this is where real warriors train, not where tourists come to take pictures. Sarah continued writing in her notepad without looking up. I'm here to observe training methods and evaluate combat effectiveness protocols, she said in an even tone. My presence has been approved by base command. The response only increased Marcus's irritation. Her professional language and calm demeanor suggested she held some kind of official position, but her civilian appearance made that seem unlikely. In Marcus's experience, most Pentagon consultants were older men in suits who stayed safely behind desks while real soldiers did the dangerous work. Combat effectiveness protocols, Marcus repeated with a sneer. Let me guess, you're some kind of expert who's going to tell us how to do our jobs better. Probably learned everything you know about fighting from books and computer simulations. A small crowd of SEALs had begun to gather around the exchange. Marcus felt energized by the attention and decided to press his advantage. He had dealt with civilian contractors before and found most of them to be theoretical thinkers who had no practical understanding of real combat situations. I bet you've never been in a real fight in your life, Marcus continued, his voice growing louder. Probably think you understand combat because you watch some martial arts videos on YouTube. Well, this is the real world, sweetheart. This is where men who actually know how to fight come to train. Sarah finally looked up from her notepad and studied Marcus with calm, intelligent eyes. She could see the crowd of soldiers gathering around them and understood that Marcus was performing for their benefit. His need to establish dominance in front of his peers was a common psychological pattern she had observed many times during her military career. I'm just here to do my job, Sarah said quietly. I'm not looking for any trouble. Marcus interpreted her measured response as weakness and decided to escalate further. He had successfully intimidated civilian contractors before and expected this situation to follow the same pattern. His physical size and intimidating presence usually caused people to back down quickly when he applied pressure. Your job, Marcus said with obvious contempt. And what job is that exactly? Teaching SEALs how to fight. Because that would be pretty funny, considering you look like you couldn't handle a middle school kid in a playground scuffle. The crowd around them had grown larger as more SEALs noticed the confrontation developing. Marcus felt the energy of his audience and decided to really put on a show. He had built his reputation partly through these kinds of public demonstrations of dominance, and this seemed like an perfect opportunity to reinforce his status as the alpha male of the group. Tell you what, Marcus announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Why don't you show us some of those combat effectiveness protocols you're here to evaluate? Maybe demonstrate some of those fighting techniques you're such an expert on. Sarah remained calm despite the increasingly hostile tone of the conversation. She had encountered similar challenges many times during her military career and had learned to recognize when someone was trying to provoke a reaction. Marcus's behavior followed a predictable pattern of masculine posturing that she had observed countless times before. I don't think that would be appropriate, Sarah replied diplomatically. I'm here in an observational capacity only. Marcus laughed loudly and looked around at his audience to make sure they were paying attention. Observational capacity, he repeated mockingly. That's a fancy way of saying you're afraid to back up all that expert knowledge with actual action. Typical civilian contractor. All talk and no substance. The crowd of SEALs was now clearly invested in the confrontation. Marcus had successfully created a situation where Sarah would look weak if she continued to avoid his challenge. He felt confident that he had cornered her in a no-win situation where she would either have to admit her limitations or face humiliation in front of hundreds of elite warriors. Come on, expert, Marcus taunted. Show us what you've got. Unless you want to admit that you don't actually know anything about real fighting, and you're just here to waste everyone's time with your theoretical nonsense. Sarah looked around at the crowd of expectant faces and realized that the situation had escalated beyond her ability to defuse through diplomacy. Marcus had successfully created a public challenge that would reflect poorly on her credibility if she continued to avoid it. Her professional reputation and future effectiveness as a consultant could be damaged if she appeared weak or incompetent in front of so many military personnel. After a moment of consideration, Sarah closed her notepad and set it aside. She looked directly at Marcus with steady eyes and spoke in a clear voice that carried across the arena. "If you insist on a demonstration," she said calmly, "I suppose we could arrange something simple. Nothing too elaborate or dangerous, just a basic exercise to satisfy your curiosity." Marcus grinned triumphantly and began rolling up his sleeves. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness something memorable. Several SEALs began placing informal bets on how quickly Marcus would be able to subdue the civilian woman who had foolishly accepted his challenge. "Now we're talking," Marcus said with obvious satisfaction. "Don't worry, I'll try to be gentle. Wouldn't want to hurt a delicate little consultant on her first day at a real military base." Sarah began removing her light jacket, revealing arms that showed more muscle definition than her loose clothing had suggested. She moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with physical confrontation, though most of the observers were too focused on Marcus to notice the subtle signs of her athletic conditioning. As the two prepared for their impromptu demonstration, neither fully understood what was about to happen. Marcus saw an opportunity to embarrass a presumptuous civilian in front of his peers, while Sarah recognized the need to establish her credibility in order to complete her mission effectively. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered long after the formal training demonstrations had been forgotten. The arena fell silent as 520 elite Navy SEALs focused their attention on the unlikely pair standing in the center of the training mat. What happened next would change how everyone present understood the true nature of combat expertise and the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. The atmosphere in the arena became electric as word spread throughout the facility that an impromptu challenge was taking place. SEALs who had been conducting other training exercises began filtering into the main arena, drawn by the unusual spectacle of their most feared warrior facing off against a mysterious civilian woman. The crowd swelled to include nearly every person on the base, creating a wall of interested spectators around the central training mat. Marcus stretched his massive arms and cracked his knuckles with theatrical flair. He had participated in hundreds of sparring matches and combat demonstrations throughout his career, but this felt different. The unusual nature of his opponent and the size of the audience created an atmosphere charged with anticipation and nervous energy. He could feel the eyes of his fellow SEALs upon him, expecting him to deliver another dominant performance that would add to his legendary reputation. "So what exactly are we doing here?" Marcus asked with a cocky grin. "Want to try some grappling? Maybe a little boxing? Or should we keep it really simple and just see who can stay standing longer?" Sarah studied her opponent with the analytical eye of a professional fighter. Marcus's physical advantages were obvious. He outweighed her by at least 80 pounds and possessed the reach and strength typical of elite male soldiers. However, she could also see the subtle signs of overconfidence that often proved fatal in real combat situations. His relaxed stance and casual attitude suggested he wasn't taking the confrontation seriously enough to maintain proper defensive awareness. "How about we start with something basic?" Sarah suggested calmly. "Simple grappling exercise. First person to achieve a submission hold or force their opponent to tap out wins. Nothing too complicated." Marcus laughed and nodded agreement. "Sounds perfect. Should be over pretty quick." He looked around at the crowd with obvious amusement. "Hope everyone's ready for a short show." The two combatants moved to the center of the mat while the crowd formed a wide circle around them. Several senior officers had noticed the commotion and taken positions where they could observe the unusual matchup. Commander Peterson, the base training coordinator, watched with particular interest since he was one of the few people present who knew the true nature of Sarah's background and credentials. "You sure about this, Sergeant Reynolds?" Commander Peterson called out. "Sometimes appearances can be deceiving." Marcus waved dismissively at his superior officer. "Don't worry, sir. I'll make it quick and clean. No harm done." The casual disrespect in Marcus's response to a direct warning from a superior officer revealed the extent of his overconfidence. Years of easy victories and constant praise had created a dangerous blind spot in his tactical thinking. He had become so accustomed to physical dominance that he had stopped considering the possibility of encountering an opponent who might pose a genuine threat. Sarah assumed a basic fighting stance with her feet slightly apart and her hands raised in a neutral position. Her posture revealed years of professional training to those who knew what to look for. But Marcus only saw a small woman trying to look intimidating. The contrast between their sizes was so dramatic that several spectators felt uncomfortable watching what seemed likely to become a one-sided beatdown. "Ladies first," Marcus said with exaggerated chivalry, gesturing for Sarah to make the opening move. Sarah shook her head politely. "You challenged me. You can have the first move." Marcus shrugged and stepped forward casually, reaching out with his right hand to grab Sarah's shoulder. His plan was simple and direct. Use his superior size and strength to quickly overwhelm her with basic wrestling techniques. He had employed this strategy successfully countless times against smaller opponents and expected identical results in this situation. The moment Marcus's hand came within striking distance, Sarah moved with explosive speed that caught everyone by surprise. Instead of trying to avoid his grasp or counter with her own grab, she stepped slightly to the side and used a precise wrist control technique to redirect his reaching arm. Before Marcus could react, Sarah had secured a grip on his wrist and forearm that gave her complete control over his movement. Marcus felt the grip tighten around his arm and instinctively tried to pull away, but discovered that Sarah's positioning made escape impossible without losing his balance. For the first time since the confrontation began, a flicker of concern crossed his features. The strength and precision of her grip suggested a level of technical skill that he hadn't expected. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered as he struggled against the hold. Sarah maintained her calm demeanor while smoothly transitioning into a more complex joint manipulation. Using leverage and precise positioning rather than brute strength, she began to apply pressure to Marcus's elbow and shoulder in a way that forced him to move in the direction she wanted. Each time he tried to counter or escape, she adjusted her technique to maintain control while increasing the pressure on his joints. The crowd had gone completely silent as they watched the unexpected turn of events. Marcus, who had never shown weakness in front of his peers, was clearly struggling against an opponent who appeared to weigh less than half what he did. The technical skill being displayed by the civilian woman was beyond anything most of the observers had seen in their own training. Marcus's face began to redden as he realized the seriousness of his situation. The joint manipulation Sarah was applying created intense pressure without causing immediate damage, but he could feel that she had the ability to inflict serious injury if she chose to increase the force. His attempts to use his superior size and strength were being neutralized by positioning and technique that he couldn't counter. Okay, Marcus said through gritted teeth. "This is getting a little intense. Maybe we should call it even." Sarah didn't release the hold. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes with an expression that had hardened from calm professionalism to something much more dangerous. "I thought you wanted a demonstration of combat effectiveness protocols," she said quietly. "Are you ready to tap out already?" The question hit Marcus like a slap in the face. Tapping out in front of 520 SEALs would destroy his reputation and end his status as the base's most feared fighter. Every story he had told about his invincibility would be proven false by a single moment of submission. The psychological pressure was almost as intense as the physical pain radiating through his trapped arm. "Hell no," Marcus growled, using his free arm to try to break Sarah's grip. "I'm just getting started." Sarah allowed him to struggle for several seconds before smoothly transitioning into a different technique. Using Marcus's own momentum against him, she guided him into an off-balance position while maintaining control of his arm. The movement looked almost like a dance to the untrained observers, but those with martial arts experience recognized the sophisticated application of leverage and timing being demonstrated. Marcus found himself being moved around the mat like a puppet on strings. Every time he tried to establish a stable base or launch a counterattack, Sarah would shift her grip or change the angle of pressure in a way that disrupted his plans. The helpless feeling of being controlled by someone so much smaller than himself was completely foreign to his experience. Commander Peterson watched the demonstration with growing amazement. He had read Sarah's classified file and knew about her exceptional qualifications, but seeing her skills applied in real time was still shocking. The level of technique she was displaying represented years of intensive training in multiple martial arts disciplines, combined with combat experience that few people in the world possessed. The crowd began to murmur as it became clear that Marcus was not going to quickly overpower his opponent as everyone had expected. Several of the SEALs who knew Marcus best exchanged worried glances, recognizing signs of genuine distress in their normally unflappable colleague. The casual challenge had evolved into something much more serious than anyone had anticipated. Sarah could sense the shift in atmosphere and realized that the demonstration had served its purpose. She had established her credibility and proven that appearances could be deceiving, which would be valuable for the remainder of her assignment. However, Marcus's pride was preventing him from accepting defeat gracefully, and she could see that the situation needed to be resolved before it escalated further. "Last chance to tap out," Sarah said quietly, positioning her grip for a technique that would end the confrontation decisively. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you force me to." Marcus's response was to throw his full weight backward in a desperate attempt to break free from her control. The move was powerful but poorly executed, leaving him vulnerable to exactly the kind of counter technique that Sarah had been preparing. She smoothly followed his movement while applying a precise joint lock that brought his arm to the absolute limit of its natural range of motion. The crowd gasped as they heard a distinct popping sound from Marcus's elbow joint. His face went pale, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead as intense pain shot through his arm. The technical precision of Sarah's technique had brought his joint to the breaking point without actually causing permanent damage, but the threat was unmistakably clear. "Tap out now," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying an authority that cut through Marcus's pain and pride. "Don't make me snap your arm in front of your friends." For several long seconds, Marcus struggled with the impossible choice between his reputation and his physical safety. The pain in his arm was becoming unbearable, and he could feel that Sarah had the leverage and technique necessary to follow through on her threat. Every instinct told him that further resistance would result in serious injury that could end his military career. The arena was completely silent as 520 elite warriors watched their most feared colleague face a moment of absolute vulnerability. The psychological tension was almost as intense as the physical confrontation taking place on the mat. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Marcus's breathing became labored as the pain in his arm reached a crescendo. His vision began to blur around the edges, and he could feel his strength ebbing away under the relentless pressure of Sarah's joint manipulation. The technique she was applying was clearly the product of advanced training and real combat experience that exceeded his own. Finally, with his face contorted in pain and his reputation hanging by a thread, Marcus made the only choice that would allow him to walk away with his arm intact. His free hand moved slowly toward the mat in the universal gesture of submission that would end the confrontation and forever change how everyone present viewed the relationship between size, strength, and fighting skill. The crowd held its collective breath as Marcus's hand hovered inches from the mat, knowing that his decision would mark the end of an era and the beginning of a new understanding about the true nature of combat expertise. Time seemed to freeze in the arena as Marcus's hand trembled inches above the mat. The weight of 520 pairs of eyes bore down on him as he faced the most humiliating moment of his military career. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the training mat below while Sarah maintained her devastating joint lock with surgical precision. The pain in his arm had become a white-hot fire that threatened to overwhelm his consciousness, but his pride fought against the inevitable surrender with desperate fury. "Don't do this to yourself," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible to the surrounding crowd. "There's no shame in recognizing superior technique. Tap out, and we can both walk away with dignity." Marcus's jaw clenched as he struggled with the impossible decision. Throughout his 12-year military career, he had built his entire identity around being the strongest, toughest, most unbeatable fighter in any room. His reputation had opened doors, earned respect, and provided the psychological armor that allowed him to function as an elite warrior in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Losing that identity in front of his peers felt like losing everything that made him who he was. The crowd remained absolutely silent, understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment that would be remembered and discussed for decades. Several of the senior officers present recognized the broader implications of what was happening. The demonstration was challenging fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness that formed the foundation of military training doctrine. Commander Peterson found himself holding his breath as he watched the confrontation reach its climax. As one of the few people who knew Sarah's true background, he understood the full significance of what the crowd was witnessing. Her classified file contained details of operations and achievements that would shock even the most experienced Special Forces personnel. The woman currently dominating their most feared warrior had credentials that surpassed those of anyone else on the base. Sarah could feel Marcus's arm approaching the absolute limit of its structural integrity. Years of experience in combat situations had taught her to recognize the precise moment when joint manipulation would transition from painful submission hold to permanent injury. She was walking a razor's edge, maintaining enough pressure to force surrender while avoiding the kind of damage that would end a military career. Marcus's vision began to tunnel as pain and oxygen deprivation combined to threaten his consciousness. The joint lock Sarah had applied was affecting circulation in addition to placing tremendous stress on his elbow and shoulder. He could feel his strength draining away like water through a broken dam, leaving him completely dependent on his opponent's mercy for the safety of his arm. 5 seconds, Sarah announced calmly, giving Marcus a final deadline to make his choice. After that, I won't be able to control what happens. The ultimatum cut through Marcus's mental fog like a knife. He suddenly realized that his stubborn refusal to submit was about to cost him his arm and potentially his career. The woman controlling him wasn't bluffing or exaggerating the danger. She possessed the technical skill and combat experience necessary to follow through on her threat, and his continued resistance was forcing her toward that outcome. With a sound that was part growl and part sob, Marcus finally slapped his free hand against the mat 3 times in rapid succession. The sharp sound of his palm striking the training surface echoed through the silent arena like gunshots, officially ending the confrontation and marking the end of his undefeated record. Sarah immediately released the joint lock and stepped back, giving Marcus space to recover while maintaining a defensive posture in case his humiliation triggered an angry retaliation. Her transition from devastating combat technique to professional restraint was seamless, demonstrating the kind of emotional control that separated elite fighters from mere physical specimens. Marcus collapsed to his knees on the mat, cradling his injured arm against his chest while trying to process what had just happened. The pain was already beginning to fade, but the psychological impact of his defeat would last much longer. Around him, 520 elite warriors stood in stunned silence, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with their previous understanding of combat dynamics. The first sound to break the silence was slow, deliberate clapping from Commander Peterson. His applause was soon joined by a few other senior officers who recognized the exceptional skill they had just observed. Within moments, the entire arena erupted in thunderous applause as the crowd finally understood that they had witnessed a demonstration of fighting prowess that exceeded anything they had seen before. Sarah acknowledged the applause with a modest nod while keeping her attention focused on Marcus. She could see that his pride had been wounded far more severely than his arm, and she understood the psychological devastation that accompanied such a public defeat. Her expression showed genuine concern for his well-being despite the fact that he had forced the confrontation through his own arrogance and aggression. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, extending her hand to help Marcus to his feet. Marcus stared at her outstretched hand for several long seconds before reluctantly accepting her assistance. Standing up required him to face the crowd of his peers who had just watched him be completely dominated by someone he had dismissed as a harmless civilian. The weight of their stares felt heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. "I'm fine," Marcus muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence and authority. Sarah studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many warriors struggle with unexpected defeat. "You fought well," she said diplomatically. That joint lock would have worked on anyone regardless of their size or strength. It's not a reflection of your abilities as a soldier or as a person. The attempt at consolation only made Marcus feel worse. Being patronized by the woman who had just humiliated him in front of his entire unit added insult to injury. He could see the mixture of shock, respect, and amusement in the faces surrounding him, and he knew that his reputation would never fully recover from this moment. Commander Peterson approached the center of the mat with a grim expression that suggested he was about to address the crowd. The unusual nature of what had just occurred required some kind of official response to prevent rumors and speculation from spreading throughout the military community. Sarah's presence at the base was part of a classified program that couldn't be compromised by loose talk. "What you just witnessed," Commander Peterson announced in a voice that carried clearly throughout the arena, was a demonstration of advanced combat techniques by a Department of Defense consultant who specializes in hand-to-hand combat effectiveness. The purpose of this exercise was to evaluate new training methods that may be incorporated into our curriculum. The explanation was technically accurate while avoiding any details that might compromise operational security. Sarah's true background and the classified nature of her assignment would remain secret, but the crowd needed some context to understand what they had seen. The commander's words provided a framework for understanding the demonstration without revealing sensitive information. "I want everyone here to remember what you've learned today," Peterson continued. "Combat effectiveness isn't determined solely by size, strength, or aggression. Technical skill, training, and tactical intelligence are equally important factors. Anyone who underestimates an opponent based on appearances is making a potentially fatal mistake." The lesson was directed primarily at Marcus, but its broader implications applied to everyone present. The demonstration had shattered several assumptions about fighting that were common among military personnel. Size and physical conditioning were important advantages, but they could be overcome by superior technique and tactical awareness. Sarah retrieved her notepad and jacket while the crowd began to disperse. Several SEALs approached her with questions about training methods and martial arts techniques, but she deflected most inquiries with polite references to security clearances and classified information. Her mission at the base required maintaining a low profile despite the dramatic nature of her introduction. Marcus remained on the mat long after most of the crowd had departed, staring at the spot where his undefeated record had come to an end. The physical pain in his arm was manageable, but the psychological impact of his defeat would require much longer to heal. Everything he had believed about his own invincibility had been proven false in front of the people whose respect he valued most. Lieutenant Commander Brooks, Marcus's direct superior, approached him with an expression that mixed concern with professional disappointment. The public nature of Marcus's defeat had created complications that would need to be addressed through official channels. His behavior toward a Pentagon consultant had been inappropriate regardless of the outcome of their confrontation. "Sergeant Reynolds," Brooks said formally, "I need to see you in my office immediately." Marcus nodded without looking up, understanding that the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. His confrontation with Sarah had started as a simple matter of wounded pride, but it had escalated into an incident that would likely affect his career prospects and standing within the SEAL community. Sarah watched the interaction from across the arena while making final notes about the training facilities and personnel she had observed. The demonstration with Marcus had been an unfortunate distraction from her primary mission, but it had also established her credibility in a way that would make the rest of her assignment much easier to complete. As she prepared to leave the arena, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred. The incident would become a teaching moment about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of respecting all potential opponents. More importantly, it had demonstrated that the most dangerous enemies were often those who didn't look threatening until it was too late to adjust tactics. The arena slowly emptied as personnel returned to their regular training schedules, but the impact of what they had witnessed would resonate throughout the base for months to come. Word of the demonstration would spread to other military installations, becoming part of the folklore that surrounded elite military units. The story would grow and change with each telling, but the core lesson would remain the same. Marcus finally stood up and walked slowly toward the exit, his injured arm serving as a constant reminder of his humiliation. Each step took him further away from the scene of his defeat, but he couldn't escape the knowledge that his reputation as an invincible warrior had been destroyed in less than 5 minutes by someone he had completely underestimated. Sarah completed her documentation and gathered her materials, preparing to continue her evaluation of the base's training programs. The confrontation with Marcus had been an unwelcome interruption, but it had also provided valuable insights into the psychological dynamics that affected combat performance. Her report would include recommendations for addressing the overconfidence and assumption-making that could prove fatal in real combat situations. 6 months after the incident that had changed everything at the Naval Special Warfare Facility, the reverberations continued to shape military training programs across multiple branches of service. Sarah Mitchell's demonstration had become legendary within Special Forces circles, spawning new protocols and challenging long-held beliefs about combat effectiveness. The story had been retold countless times, each version adding new details while preserving the core message about the dangers of underestimating opponents based on appearances. Marcus Reynolds sat in the office of Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a military psychologist who specialized in helping elite soldiers process traumatic experiences and career transitions. The mandatory counseling sessions had begun 3 months earlier when his commanding officers recognized that his psychological state was affecting his performance and leadership capabilities. The once confident warrior now struggled with self-doubt and anxiety that interfered with his ability to function effectively as a Navy SEAL. "Tell me about your progress with the new training methods," Dr. Hayes said, reviewing notes from their previous sessions. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his right arm still showing subtle signs of stiffness from the joint manipulation he had endured. "It's different," he admitted reluctantly. "I used to rely mostly on size and strength. Now I'm learning techniques that work regardless of physical advantages." The humiliation of his defeat had forced Marcus to completely reevaluate his approach to combat training. Under the guidance of new instructors who had been brought in following Sarah's recommendations, he was learning martial arts techniques that emphasized leverage, timing, and precision over brute force. The process was challenging for someone who had built his entire identity around physical dominance. Dr. Hayes nodded encouragingly. "How does that make you feel about your capabilities as a warrior?" Honestly, Marcus paused, struggling to find words for emotions he had never experienced before. "Sometimes I think I'm better than I ever was. These new techniques work against opponents who are bigger and stronger than me. But other times, I feel like everything I accomplished before was just luck." The internal conflict was evident in Marcus's voice and body language. His defeat had shattered his confidence, while simultaneously opening his mind to possibilities he had never considered. The psychological journey from arrogant certainty to humble learning was proving more difficult than any physical challenge he had faced during his military career. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was presenting her findings to a room full of Pentagon officials who had gathered to review her comprehensive assessment of Special Forces training programs. Her report contained detailed recommendations for integrating advanced martial arts techniques into standard military curriculum, with specific emphasis on psychological preparation and assumption management. "The primary weakness we observed," Sarah explained to the assembled group of generals and analysts, "was not a lack of physical capability or combat experience. It was the dangerous tendency to underestimate potential threats based on superficial characteristics. This cognitive bias has tactical implications that extend far beyond individual combat scenarios." General Morrison, the senior officer overseeing the review, leaned forward with interest. "Can you elaborate on the broader tactical implications?" Sarah activated a presentation screen that displayed combat statistics and analysis charts. Enemy forces frequently use deception and misdirection to exploit exactly these kinds of assumptions. Operatives who appear weak, female, elderly, or civilian are often the most dangerous because they benefit from reduced threat assessment by their targets. Our personnel need training that addresses these psychological vulnerabilities. The presentation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from modified training protocols to psychological evaluation procedures. Sarah's recommendations were comprehensive and practical, based on extensive research and real-world testing conducted at multiple military facilities. The incident with Marcus had provided a perfect case study for the problems she had been hired to address. Back at the Coronado facility, word had spread about the changes being implemented in response to Sarah's report. The new training program included mandatory classes on cognitive bias recognition, advanced martial arts instruction, and regular exercises designed to challenge assumptions about opponent capabilities. The curriculum was being watched closely by military leaders who were considering similar implementations across all Special Forces units. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh had been assigned to help implement the new training protocols after demonstrating exceptional proficiency in the techniques Sarah had introduced. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, Walsh had initially faced skepticism from some of her male colleagues, but her technical skills quickly earned their respect. She had become living proof of Sarah's assertions about the importance of technique over physical advantages. The key principle, Walsh explained to a group of new recruits, is that every opponent represents a potential threat regardless of their appearance. Your survival depends on maintaining tactical awareness and avoiding the assumption that size or obvious strength indicators determine combat outcomes. The lesson was being taught in the same arena where Sarah had demonstrated these principles with such devastating effectiveness. Many of the SEALs present remembered watching Marcus's defeat, and the memory served as a powerful reinforcement for the concepts being presented. The training facility had been modified to include equipment and scenarios specifically designed to challenge preconceptions about threat assessment. Marcus had volunteered to participate in the new training program as both student and instructor. His experience provided a unique perspective on the psychological challenges involved in abandoning old assumptions and embracing new approaches. Despite the personal cost of his defeat, he had come to understand the value of the lessons Sarah had taught through her demonstration. I spent 12 years thinking that being the biggest and strongest guy in the room made me invincible, Marcus told a group of younger SEALs during a training session. That kind of thinking almost cost me my arm and definitely cost me my effectiveness as a warrior. The new techniques we're learning will make you better fighters and better soldiers. His willingness to discuss his defeat openly had gradually restored some of his credibility within the unit. The other SEALs respected his courage in facing his mistakes and his dedication to improving from the experience. Marcus was slowly rebuilding his reputation on a foundation of humility and technical skill rather than intimidation and physical dominance. Sarah continued her work as a consultant, traveling to military bases around the world to implement similar training programs. Her success at Coronado had led to assignments with Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and International Special Forces units. The principles she taught were being integrated into military doctrine at the highest levels, influencing how elite soldiers approached combat preparation and threat assessment. During a follow-up visit to Coronado 9 months after the original incident, Sarah was invited to observe a training exercise that demonstrated the progress being made under the new protocols. She watched from the observation deck as SEALs practiced techniques that emphasized adaptability, assumption management, and respect for all potential opponents. Marcus was leading one of the training groups, demonstrating joint manipulation techniques with the same enthusiasm he had once reserved for displays of brute strength. His transformation from arrogant bully to thoughtful instructor represented exactly the kind of change Sarah had hoped to achieve through her work. The psychological growth was as impressive as the technical improvement. After the exercise, Marcus approached Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude and lingering embarrassment. "I wanted to thank you," he said formally. "What happened between us was the best thing that could have happened to my career, even though I didn't understand it at the time." Sarah studied his face and saw genuine sincerity in his words. "You did the hard work," she replied. "I just provided the motivation. Learning from failure takes more courage than winning ever does." The conversation was brief but meaningful, representing closure for both participants in the dramatic confrontation that had changed so many lives. Marcus returned to his duties with renewed confidence based on genuine skill rather than false assumptions. Sarah continued her mission of challenging military personnel to question their preconceptions about combat effectiveness. Commander Peterson, who had overseen the entire transformation process, submitted a detailed report to his superiors about the success of the new training programs. Statistical analysis showed significant improvements in combat effectiveness ratings, psychological resilience scores, and tactical adaptation capabilities among personnel who had completed the enhanced curriculum. The implementation of assumption management protocols has exceeded all projected outcomes, Peterson wrote in his summary. Personnel who previously relied on physical intimidation and size advantages have developed technical skills that make them more effective in diverse combat scenarios. The program should be expanded to all Special Forces units. The recommendation was quickly approved and implemented across multiple military branches. Sarah's work had evolved from a single dramatic demonstration into a comprehensive revolution in how elite soldiers approached combat training and psychological preparation. The principles she taught were saving lives and improving mission success rates in operational environments around the world. Years later, the story of Sarah's confrontation with Marcus became part of military folklore, retold in training academies and officer schools as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and overconfidence. The incident had transcended its original context to become a teaching tool for multiple generations of military personnel. Marcus completed his military service with distinction, having rebuilt his reputation through dedication to the new training methods and his willingness to share his experiences with others. His defeat had ultimately made him a better soldier and a more effective leader. The painful lesson had transformed weakness into strength through honest self-examination and persistent effort. Sarah continued her work as a consultant and instructor, always carrying the memory of that day in the Coronado arena when a single demonstration had changed everything. Her success in challenging fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness had opened doors to new opportunities and responsibilities. The woman who had once been dismissed as a harmless civilian had become one of the most respected voices in military training doctrine. The legacy of their confrontation lived on in the thousands of soldiers who learned to question their assumptions, respect all potential opponents, and understand that true strength came from skill, preparation, and tactical awareness rather than size and intimidation. The lesson had been painful for everyone involved, but its impact would continue protecting lives and improving mission outcomes for decades to come. The arena at Coronado remained a symbol of transformation and growth, where legends were both created and destroyed in the pursuit of excellence. The story of what happened there would never be forgotten, serving as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous mistake a warrior could make was underestimating an opponent based on appearances. In a world where survival depended on split-second decisions and accurate threat assessment, that lesson was worth more than all the physical strength and intimidation tactics ever developed.